synthetic methane, synthetic liquid fuels, by capturing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and mixing it with the hydrogen, because that produces methane, which is a much more storable, transferable gas, or it produces liquid fuels that you can then use for haulage lorries or for backup power stations to fill the gaps between big renewables. But capturing that carbon means rethinking land use. So we then employed a dietitian. The dietitian helped us think about how we use land at the moment. The inner circle is what we should eat as human beings, healthy mix of food. The outer circle is average diet today and an average diet in the zero carbon Britain scenario. We should be eating 33% fruit and veg, we're eating 9% fruit and veg. We should be eating 10% high fats and sugar foods, we're eating 43%. We have been coaxed and encouraged and lazy and well-informed, and we're eating a far wrong mix of stuff. Now, that represents itself in land use as huge amounts of land, the pink and the yellow in the dot area. This is the total amount of land that we use today. The pink and the yellow is the grassland for livestock and the food for livestock. We spend enormous amounts of land growing food to feed the livestock, to eat the livestock. If we switch to a sensible diet, we can free up land for energy fuel and particularly to fill the gaps between big renewables, but we can also free up land for carbon capture for net negative processes, beginning to revitalise some of the peatlands and the wild spaces can actually capture carbon. So what I'm saying is we can grow most of our own food for the UK, for a healthy diet, and make more space for our land users. So we can get down to the point of reducing emissions from energy to zero. There's still some multiplier effect from aviation emissions because we can use biofuels that we produce to power aeroplanes, but not particularly growing amounts of long haul. It means reducing by to about a third the amount of long haul flights and switching short haul to rail systems, smart, fast rail systems. But we can get to net zero. We have the technologies to do it. And showing that we have the technologies opens new conversations. And I'm going to leave a copy of the report for you all to borrow with the chair, in case you don't want to read it on a tablet or on a computer. But the idea is it's not meant to be the only scenario that can save the planet. It's one possible scenario to show how we could do it. We can tweak it, we can twist it, we can make everybody vegan, or we can make a bit more meat, you can alter the figures. But more and more countries around the world are also doing these rapid decarbonisation models. There's 50 plans for 50 US states to run on 100% renewables. Stanford University or Denmark's Project Zero has a plan for getting the whole of the Sonderberg region down to net zero emissions by 2029. So we have to think, why isn't this happening? Why is this not happening every day? We've got to look around and see what's going on. It's often down to corporate interest. The Corporation is a fascinating film. It's well worth watching as a group. If this was the annual general meeting of a huge fossil fuel company, and you were all the shareholders and I was the CEO, you'd want me to maximise your investment in pipelines and refineries. And the investment isn't necessarily evil money from evil billionaires, it's pension funds from ordinary working people, it's endowments from hospitals. But the trouble is, on the books of the big energy companies, is far more fossil fuels that we can safely burn. 69% of the fossil fuels on the books of the big energy companies are unburnable. We can't burn that. So there's this huge stranded asset of money we've put in the wrong place. But that money exerts pressure back down the pipeline through lobbying. They just want to keep burning it just for another year, just to keep dividends up, so the CEOs keep their jobs. And that sort of lobbying exerts enormous amounts of political pressure. It also exerts enormous amounts of pressure on the media through advertising and through just companies that own media. And what the media says who you should vote for affects who gets elected. So we have to think how we can make change happen fast enough. But the challenges are not only technological, they're cultural and political. That's what we're saying. We have the technologies, we have to change how we think about human beings and energy. Essentially recognise that we need a cultural shift. Because this relationship didn't just happen by chance, isn't progress gone slightly wrong. This fossil-fueled American dream was quite deliberately designed and inserted into our culture. But we have to recognise it's a broken dream. We have to let it go. Fossil fuels can't stepping stone to the next chapter in our story. If we're to get from early human societies to Angela Merkel flying over and marvelling over a huge German offshore wind farm, fossil fuels have enabled that transition. They've enabled us to move to doing what we're doing today. Just like the yolk of an egg is captured sunlight that the mother hen captured to use to allow the embryo of the chick to grow until it's ready to hatch out of the egg and live off the sunlight and live off its annual sunlight ration. We need to, like the chick, break out the fossil fuel dependency and start living on our annual sunlight ration again. But that doesn't mean as you leave we'll be handing out smocks and ploughs, because that was a time when we had soil, canvas sheet and wooden poles for collecting our annual renewable energy ration. Today we have an enormous range of incredible technologies that can capture far more of our annual renewable energy ration than we actually need to power the things that we do, if we can switch to a more rational way of using energy. But the trouble is, we know this, we hear about it in documentaries, but the characters in the big budget popular TV shows, George Clooney and EastEnders, they never talk about recycling, cycling, not flying, buying sustainable products. So we need to get this out in the popular culture. And popular culture has used films, books, novels, music to allow young people to challenge the values that their parents inflict upon them. Time and time again, over generations, we've reshaped values, we've reshaped how we think about things, we've changed how we are, changed culture, and we have all the tools to change it today in an incredible way. The lives of millions of people have been improved by cultural shifts, changing health and safety at the workplace, race, gender. So we've been engaging with Arts Council Wales with this report, Culture Shift. You can download from the Zero Carbon Britain website, which is sort of helping us see our own blind spots, looking at how artists are being their provocations, helping us think of new attitudes and approaches and values and tools, and I suppose challenging this idea that fossil fuels equals male virility, which has sort of been drummed into us for years. And clever interventions that make us think slightly differently.
Vet du något heter här igen?
Ja.
Tror du att det är en telefon till Sebastian idag?
Nei, ok da. Jeg skal levere den tilbake nå.
Miljøagenter har rett til å si fra, for de er med på å forme sin egen fremtid. Du kan melde inn ditt barn på miljøagentene.no.
Jeg er ikke sint. Jeg er bare veldig, veldig skuffet.
So we do this really as a tool to offer to you who are out there pioneering these glimpses of a sustainable future, dappled here in the present, that will join up and become commonplace. We have all sorts of things on the stall at the back from CAT. We have 6-page summaries we're going to leave with you. We've got the copies of the report will be downloaded for free from the website, and we have short courses, and also we have a postgraduate program that we run at CAT that can give you a formal postgraduate degree, academically robust, but you get your hands dirty. In fact, you get filthy from top to toe, I promise you. And it's a very fun place to learn. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Paul. That's really, really interesting, isn't it? Wow. We have a lot to think about there, don't we? And I'll see you later to ask Paul any questions you have. So, thinking about one of the challenges there about how can we respond locally and what's happening locally here in Hanover, of which we have 4 amazing local activists. So I'll just briefly introduce them, if I may, and they'll be speaking for about 5 or 6 minutes each on what they're doing. So if I can introduce, first of all, to Vera, who is a community activist from the Food Waste Collective, and you'll be speaking about local food waste issues. Yeah. Okay, if I can introduce you to Robin, who is a local journalist and a writer on land use, who will be speaking about local food enterprises and responses to climate change. Is that right? Okay, and if I could introduce you to Councillor Ian Davey, who is the Green Party lead member on transport. He's the man responsible for all the lovely bus and cycle lanes around the city, of course. And he'll be speaking on local sustainable travel. And then if I could introduce Paul at the end here, he's the local Hassel 1010 coordinator. And he's, of course, spent huge amounts of personal energy in energy reduction here in the Hanover Centre. So, who would like to start? Any preferences? Anybody want to? Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Hello. Stop me if I was wrong too long, by the way. So I'll just explain to you briefly who I am, so why I'm here. I've got a slightly eclectic career working in this area. I worked for Friends of the Earth for 7 years. Written quite a lot about kind of food sustainability issues, and then for the last few years I shifted to writing about how the media covers climate change, which was quite an interesting experience. So I thought I'd start off by telling you a little bit of a story actually. When I was freelancing some years ago, and a group of freelancers went to a local food enterprise organisation, and they said to us, we really want you to write a report about how great community food enterprises are for climate change, like reducing food miles and all that kind of stuff. We went, okay, great, fantastic. And then we went off and sort of started researching it, and then went, turns out it was like way more complicated than we thought, because obviously the kind of simplistic ideas that you can look at about food miles, saying you reduce food miles, it reduces emissions, but actually if you think about sort of the way that food gets to us, you've got to think about how it was produced, the inputs to the food farming system, what happens when you travel from that food to the retailer, from the retailer to the person that consumes it, how it was cooked. In other words, the whole kind of life cycle of emissions that at that time was being researched and looked at by various different researchers. And some were saying, well, some local food enterprises aren't that great actually. It kind of depends, you have to kind of play off the difference between how something was farmed, whether a lot of nitrogen was put into the soil when it was farmed, or how the transport was done at the other end before it was actually even got to the consumer. So you thought, oh, okay, that's good. How are we going to justify this report that we said we're going to write? But actually, to get more into it, we started talking to people from like community support agriculture, people who are involved in community farms and in vegetable boxes, all sorts of this kind of massive diversity that are called local food enterprises, and begin to see how kind of flexible these organisations were. There were people that actually, once they started looking at the whole chain, were really sort of get in there and start playing with it and thinking, well, how do we change our distribution system? And perhaps even most crucially, they had some contact with their consumers, so they were talking to people. So one of the local food enterprises we talked to did a survey in which 95% of people that were buying from them said, well, actually, since I started buying from you, I've changed the way I consume food to some extent. And, eat more seasonally or thinking about it more. And like at that time, I'd been kind of trained to, think kind of emissions, reduce your emissions, count it all up. But I started to think more about kind of our cultural response to climate change. And actually, just as you were saying, you have to start to change within yourself and to talk about it within society in order for this change to happen. The stuff from Zero Carbon Britain, I've had a career of kind of saying we must reduce emissions by X% by 2020 and X% by 2030. And those numbers, they all seem quite far away most of the time. And suddenly it's 2015 and they're seeming a little bit closer. And 2030 is actually only 15 years away. And it's thinking about this a change in society, and actually how do we catalyse it? It is an enormous challenge for us all. But I mean, some of the things that I've been involved with, for example, when I first started working on energy issues back in 2007, they had these things called levelised cost curves, which were really, really boring. But they basically compared the costs of different energy technologies. And solar power on that cost curve was basically over there in hell. You know, we didn't think about the cost of solar power. It was way too expensive. And there was no thought within government that the costs could come down, that solar power, costs of solar power could change. Within 5 or 6 years, there was a campaign for feed-in tariffs in this country. So many other countries also introduced the new support measures for solar power. The cost of generating solar panels suddenly crashed. Within 5 years, the cost of producing solar energy halved. And we saw a huge change, not just in this country, but around the world. And now we're looking at approaching what they call grid parity, so where the cost of solar power is about the same as the cost of fossil fuels on the grid. It's in quite a lot of countries we're approaching that point, and it's been an entirely unprecedented change. You know, change that nobody in government was thinking was going to happen sort of 10 or 15 years ago. And I suppose it's that realisation that abrupt change is built on people who are kind of slogging away for years, which is one of the things that keeps me going. And in the world of kind of writing about kind of energy policy, and it's all kind of phrases like projections and parts per million, and just really, I was trying to write about something called EINDCs this morning. All these ridiculous acronyms, and it can start to feel very far away from who we are as human beings. But I think reports like Zero Carbon Britain, where actually we're saying, you have a phrase in there that I really liked, taking a physically realistic perspective rather than adhering to what might be politically and socially palatable today. I think it's so important for us to have that kind of visioning and to think about how society actually could change, and that kind of, you know, look at the future and then think back to how we can get that kind of approach, rather than getting stuck in the kind of iterative way of thinking that I think a lot of our national policy debate is sadly stuck in. And that's one of the things, I guess that's one of the things that kind of keeps me going, is that idea that there is a vision out there, and that abrupt change is possible and can